Welcome everyone to this webinar on the role to play from Nova SPE. Today we're going to have a webinar on scenario thinking and scenario planning. And we think, of course, this is a very important topic given the current crisis we're facing and the volatility of the environment we're observing. There's a whole range of fundamental changes taking place right now, and the landscape of geopolitics is also changing as we speak. So we think that the ability to think about future scenarios and to plan around those future scenarios is critical for organizations to survive. We have the pleasure of counting with an expert with us today, Antonio Alvarenga, professor at Nova SPE and an expert on scenario planning, as we said. And we also have Diego Almeida from GALP, senior strategy advisor at the company, who has had an opportunity to implement and to work around scenarios as well. So today we'll have a short presentation by Antonio on scenario thinking and scenario planning, followed by some experiences, both from Nova's perspective, and I will share also our own experience with the process of scenario thinking. And from the example of GALP, and Diego will share some thoughts on that as well. And more towards the end, we will also open the floor for questions and some answers from our side to try to clarify how scenario planning could help you in addressing your challenges. So that will work more towards the end. There will be a Q&A box there for you to pose your questions, and I will work a bit as a host today, and I will, based on the questions you have, select maybe one or two or three, depending on the time we have, to continue our conversation in the end. So with that said, and without any further ado, I would like to pass the words to Antonio with his initial presentation, and then we'll take it from there. Antonio, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Milton. Thank you very much for being a host in this session. Thank you all for being here again, some of you, and thank you, Diogo, for accepting the challenge of bringing here, of coming and bringing to share with us the GALP's very interesting experience with scenarios. I will share my presentation and try to be as quick as possible to just make an introduction to the topic, and then trying to have enough time for discussion and presenting the two cases and answering and getting some Q&A. So basically the ambition of this webinar is about first building on the information we share on the first webinar that is available on Roll to Play and YouTube, and defining or reminding what are scenarios, and then trying to deal with that very sensitive relation between scenarios and strategy definition. And then, of course, trying to get some insights and some learnings from the hands-on experience of GALP and Nova SPE executive education. So my first question is, what is a good strategy? What is a good plan? How can we be aligned? So in order to have, let's call it a good strategy, we need, of course, to be aligned in terms of what are our priorities, what are we aiming at. But there's another thing that we should consider when we think about alignment. We should also be aligned in terms of the plausible contextual futures and relevant contextual futures in which our strategy will be deployed. So it's not good enough to be aligned in terms of what are our priorities. We should be aligned in terms of what are our priorities and in which strategic contexts, strategic environments, these priorities, this strategy will be tested, will be deployed. And those contexts are scenarios. So scenarios, the descriptions of those contexts. So scenarios are narratives of alternative environments in which today's decisions may be played out. So they are not predictions, we are not forecasting. It's not about predictions, it's about anticipating plausible, relevant futures, relevant for our strategic question, for our starting question. So they are not strategies as well. So we develop scenarios and then we test our strategy. And we try to understand what happens to our strategy, to our priorities, or what kind of priorities do we need to have in different scenarios. How do we need to change our current strategy if different scenarios are developed, if different environments come out, okay? So instead, scenarios are hypotheses of different futures specifically designed to highlight the risks and opportunities involved in specific strategic issues. So just an example. Very quickly, I have 2 minutes to present this example, but I will try. So this is a very well-known way of building scenarios from the intuitive logic school, also called the shell school. And just imagine you have two uncertainties and two axes, each one with one uncertainty that we call key uncertainty, and each uncertainty with two configurations, two hypotheses. So in the horizontal axis, on the left, you have the confinement. In the horizontal axis, you have the confinements, the evolution of this health situation. On the left, you have, okay, after summer, we go back not to normal, but to pre-normal. So schools open, business, are different, of course, but, there's, we go back to not a normal, but a pre-normal situation. There's no second outbreak or not a very serious second outbreak. On the right, you have new outbreaks frequent. We don't have a vaccine. We don't have treatments for the next couple of years. So new confinements and a new outbreak even stronger after summer. Okay, so two different hypotheses for the variable. On the horizontal axis, you have the global value chain. So on the top, the crisis will at the beginning, will bring some tensions, but afterwards the global value chains will be reshaped, but will be able to be, to be reorganized. We can trust the global supply chains, the global value chains. The globalization, goes back to its track. Free movement of people, of goods, of services, no trade wars, etc. On the other side, you have a more, let's call it from the point of view of globalization, a more pessimistic view. So all the evidence that we had before already, some trade disputes, a new we first approach, a more closed, insecure world. So okay, let's accept these two axes, and what do we find in the quadrant? So scenario one, it's probably a very difficult scenario, maybe a worst case scenario. So the best scenario, not the worst case, the best case scenario, the best scenario. So we are back to pre-normal and we are able to rebuild our value chain. So it's like a Schumpeterian world. So it's like all this period was very difficult, very hard, but capital was an opportunity for capital reallocation. So it was an opportunity for digitalization, for investing in the new world will be built in a different way, more aligned with the global challenges. So it was very serious, it was scary, but we will come back quickly. The opposite, the name is inspiring on the Game of Thrones series. So it's the idea is the long winter. So basically, the outbreaks are the new normal. We go to we go outside, we come back, we go outside, we come back. There's no trust, so there's no trust in terms of health, and there's no trust in terms of trade. So global downturn, a very insecure value chain, and it's like a more the idea of a community of self-sufficiency. There's communities, countries close in themselves. Then scenario two, it's called the letter. It's inspiring the Ursula von der Leyen letter, and the idea is that to the Italian government, after the outbreak, and saying Europe was sorry for the lack of response and for being late in helping the Italians and in the beginning. And the idea is that this letter, this recognition, was the start of a much more cooperative, collective answer to the crisis. And that, in Europe we have all this new financial package to help the countries that suffer the most during the crisis. And finally, this scenario number three, we call strong men because they are all men, is it's a closed world with okay, we go back to the pre-normal after summer, but the world remains closed and remains insecure. And the idea is that, you know, this new nationalism trends became stronger with the crisis. So it's a world of conflict, of fragmentation, of state capitalism, of new industrial policy, of protectionism. Okay? So just an idea of what are scenarios. But scenarios are not only names and highlights and high concepts and key uncertainties. So scenarios are, we have to select the key uncertainties. We need to find good names that highlight the characteristics of the scenario. But then we can go deeper. We need to describe, to write an abstract. We can quantify the scenarios. We can put numbers, you know, plausible numbers, illustrative numbers on the scenarios. And then we can develop actors, power relations, deep causes. You know, we can develop a timeline. We can develop personas and narratives, etc. Symbolic and compatible and emblematic narratives, trying to describe what happens in each of the scenarios. What are the changes coming out of the scenarios? So these are scenarios. How can we link scenarios with strategies? So we can do a lot of things. Since very simple things like the ones you have on the top. So from the different scenarios, you have the implications, options, and you can do a SWOT analysis where the opportunities and threats don't come just from a hypothetical future, but come from different futures. So different futures bring different opportunities and threats. And then we can complexify. So we can identify core competencies coming from the different scenarios. We can analyze the different industry configurations coming from the different scenarios, develop different business models to answer different scenarios, etc., etc., etc. Just an example, how to apply, you know, SWOT, very simple SWOT analysis, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, not in a static way, but, you know, enlarging the analysis to different scenarios, analyzing different opportunities, even threats coming from different scenarios. Just the simplest way of connecting scenarios with the strategy, with identification of opportunities and threats. And that's it from my side. It was very, very quick, but you know, of course I'm available to answer, and I would like to pass to Milton and to have time to some sharing of the experiences of Nova SPE, executive education, and GALP, of course.
Well, thank you very much, Antonio, for your presentation and for your insights into what scenario thinking and scenario planning is, and how it is different from strategy and how it supports strategy. I can share a few words on our own experience at Nova in applying this methodology. We have a strong ambition, of course. Since a few years, we want to expand internationally, and that's a fundamental sort of driver in the organization. But of course, the world is very big, and there's many things you can do. So you need to make strategic choices, and we actually engage on a scenario thinking process together with Antonio to try to make sense of which scenario or which scenarios would be available to us, and to guide our strategic choices from those scenarios. So in that sense, it was a critical, what we like to call in academia, sense-making process, where we're kind of making sense of reality, not to be precise and to be exact, but to have a sense of what's going on around us, and to have a sort of a mental framework for us to guide our decisions. My experience, my personal experience, I was involved in the process, was very positive. And I think also for the whole organization in the whole strategic development process. I like one word that you emphasized there, Antonio, very much, which is this idea of a strategic conversation. And that conversation has multiple effects in the organization. One is the sense of ownership. And I really like the process of scenario thinking, because through these conversations, you unlock collective intelligence, but you create also a sense of ownership. So people feel engaged, they feel they are part of the process, and in doing that, the level of commitment towards the strategy that will be devised and the level of commitment towards the change that might come it starts from early on, and that's something that I really experienced as being very positive. The other thing is that it kind of gives you a sort of a agility tool, right? Because on one hand, like Eisenhower used to say, right? So plans are nothing, but planning is everything. So that exercise, you know that things will go differently, but the fact that you kind of thought of possible scenarios makes you more lean and agile to adjust when things change. And also important is that through those conversations, you understand also, you create clarity about the priorities and what is important for you as an organization. And in doing that, when you go into strategy execution and definition and later execution, you are also building in more agility in the organization because people understand what we care about, what is important, and sometimes more important than knowing what to do, we know what we don't want to do. So that agility and a sense of ownership and commitment for me was maybe the most or one of the most important key takeaways of the entire process that in my view makes this process of scenario thinking quite relevant and quite strategic, even more so in this highly uncertain environment where we're living. This process is of course critical. But I'd like to also hear from GALP and from Diogo's experience what he thinks about this process and what sort of benefits and challenges GALP faced in applying scenario thinking. So Diogo, I'd like to pass the word to you now.
Okay, thank you very much, Milton. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm very glad to be here talking with you about a very relevant issue for us and for me especially. The energy sector is, well, is one of the sectors where this sort of methodologies has been used for longer. Shell is a reference, for instance, using scenario planning, and they even publicly say that they avoided part of the 70s oil crisis on their portfolio due to the experience they already have with scenarios, just for us to have an idea of the impact this has on organizations. For us, this way of thought we've been developing for the past 5 years since the crash in the oil crash in 2015, and well, the energy transition which was already undergoing, and we understood that for us as an integrated energy company, we had to better assess the way the roads ahead, and the energy sector is under huge stress, and at the time we identified, well, we used a very similar methodology to what Antonio presented to you a while ago. So yes, we also have two axes of uncertainty, and well, we defined them 5 years ago, and today they still make all the sense, if not more. And we have an axis on technology and the way technology disrupts our sector, and another one on regulation. And so by crossing these two axes, we were able to build four very different scenarios. And not going into much detail on our scenarios, but more on the methodology and the way it's relevant for us working with it. This allowed us to have a much broader perspective. And so we were able to see that we were not forced on a single path. And that's one of the beauties of what Antonio also mentioned, which is the importance of having very coherent narratives behind the scenarios. This forces you to have, well, the thought, the qualitative aspects of scenarios on the first thing, as also Milton said, is one of the most important things from this exercise. Obviously, after that, you can have much other things as we do, because we use scenarios to to understand if our strategy makes sense, to confront it, and we have to put figures behind it and to identify the value at risk of our organization in each one of those scenarios. But the single exercise of thinking about different roads ahead, for me, is the essence of scenario planning. And I'll just identify from this view three benefits from this methodology, which are clear for me. One of them has to do with avoiding group thinking, which is very common in organizations. So having 4 scenarios as we do, and any one of them able to happen, you're immediately out of group thinking. You have people thinking that this one is better than the other one. So the idea of have a leader saying something and the other one and all the other ones, the herd going behind it, you avoid that with scenarios. Another important thing is bringing back the why, permanently questioning, having an open perspective about the issues and thinking out of the box. That's very important also. And the third is, and it happens a lot when you have short-term analysis, is avoiding a perspective that, well, we know trees don't grow to the sky, right? So you can't have a plan where your market is constantly growing forever and ever and ever. And that's often what happens when you don't have a long-term view critical on your work. Now, I would also like to leave 3 points, 3 challenges that we've discovered on this process, and which make the next step also always better than the previous. One of them is the risk of analysis paralysis when you work with scenarios. If you have leaders used to have one view, okay, this is the view, I'm very comfortable with it, I'll follow this view, and my strategy has to adapt to this view. If you have 4 different probable views, then it's much harder to take decisions, okay? So much more challenging, but the ones you make, I'd say, will be more resilient also. Another one has to do with cherry picking, avoiding the risk of choosing one scenario ahead of the others. If that happens, something's wrong with your scenarios. You shouldn't have a scenario much more probable than the others. That's not typically the goal of the methodology, although obviously you have different ways of doing this. And thirdly, and this one is also very important, and it's part of our experience also, of the road we've traveled, has to do with understanding there's a moment where you just stop using this. Scenarios are useful for strategic planning until a certain point. Then onwards, you need to understand, okay, we've done this exercise, now I need to get things done. And so I believe something around this will happen, and now I have a plan. And I don't have 4 plans, I have 1 plan based on my experience, but I've left my scenarios behind at a certain point, okay? This is very fast, some of the points I've taken from the way we've been working with scenarios at GALP.
Thank you very much, Dirk. It was very helpful, and I think you've highlighted a very few important aspects that are critical in scenario planning. One is indeed at some point you need to make choices as well, right? And you cannot go on kind of brainstorming about what could happen all the time. You need to take decisions and take risks as well. But I like very much this idea that you said about, scenario thinking, promoting divergence and promoting sort of raising up possibilities and avoiding group thinking. I think is a very, especially in organizations run by strong leaders, a process like this can kind of force the system to look at other possibilities there. So very good observations. We have already one particular question. There's a few other thoughts that come to my mind. There's one particular question I think is for the expert in the room here. Antonio, you have a question about whether there's in literature on scenario thinking and planning that you could recommend for someone who's just starting? So I guess there's people who are curious, but it's still maybe a bit lost in how to implement this.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, João, for your question, João Barbosa. Well, my favorite book is actually in Nova, Roll to Play. There's a section on recommended books, and I wrote a short, 2 paragraphs about my favorite book about scenarios. It's called Scenarios: The Art of Strategic Conversation by a Dutch academic and practitioner that also work in Shell called Kees van der Eyden. And that's my favorite book because it's at the same time very clear, but also with very good analysis, very hands-on tools, and it's my favorite book of scenarios that I will recommend. Scenarios: The Art of Strategic Conversation, but it's in Nova Roll to Play website. In Portuguese, if I don't want to recommend my own things, but we published a very recent chapter on the book called MBA for Managers and Engineers. It's in Portuguese, edited by Syllabo, and there's a chapter with about foresight and scenarios with some cases also described there. But of course, I'm always open if you want, and if you want more guidance to help you with that, you just need to send me an email. Okay. Thank you for the question.
Thank you very much, Antonio. Thank you, João, for your question. So I have 1 or 2. The time is of course very limited, but I have 2 questions. Let's see if we can wrap it up into one question. One thing is that also following on what Diogo was telling about, at some point you cannot go on scenario thinking forever. How frequent should companies engage in such exercises? It's something you do yearly, weekly, monthly, bi-weekly, every 5 years. What is the frequency that you would, recommend, or do you see as being useful when applying scenario thinking?
Milton, do you want me? Should I start? Was it for me the question? Yeah. Okay. So the way I see today's scenarios, the way we see today, and I've been working for many years already. The way I see it is like a great and amazing mechanism of translating the change, complex change in the world, in the complex, relevant change in the world, translate it and bring it to the decision-making processes inside an organization. So, generically, I would say there's what happens is that the first effort, you start your scenario, you build your first scenario set, and it requires a little bit more of effort because you need to do your own learning experience, do some scanning, find the key variables, do discussions, involve the company and the organization, the stakeholders and the knowledge holders, etc. But then what happens is that it becomes a lenses through which the company watches the world. And then when the world changes, it's very clear that it becomes clear what are the impacts on the scenario structure, on the scenario framework that was developed. So, I could say, yearly, you should update it, but it depends. When they're, of course, now, most companies that are doing scenarios, I'm sure GALP as well, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but they are reviewing their scenario analysis and their scenario set because there was this big disruption, and probably some of the conclusions need to be updated. Are these still the key variables? Are these still the implications? What are the economic change that we are expecting? Although, so I would say, put it in insert the scenario planning exercise in your ongoing planning cycle, and then when big change comes, try to identify what are the implications for your current set of scenarios. That's my answer.
Thank you. So maybe Diogo, I don't know if you can share your experience at GALP, how often you engage in these exercises?
Well, yes, we have a process for this. So yes, we know exactly when should we do this. Obviously, reality is sometimes, almost always, the future is never what we think it will be. So we're always ready to do also an assessment whenever needed. What we do generally, well, we have, as I said, besides having the scenarios, behind each one of them, we have a huge database of data set and lots of information on the way the world's energy demand, etc. So we update that on a yearly basis just to make sure everything's more or less aligned with what we have in mind. But and every 2 years we look at our trends and uncertainties to make sure, just to understand, is there anything different? What we find of these differences are enough to change the general structure of our scenarios. For the time being, we haven't changed their names, but what we've done is they all move together. So if we see the world moving from one year to the other, moving more towards, for instance, renewables, then we move the 4 scenarios that way, just to make sure that otherwise you could risk having one of them as a base case almost, because the world was moving towards it. So we avoid that. We want them to be always different from the reality we're seeing as a general base case, and so we move them all together to make sure this challenge, the challenge they give us, is always the same. Okay, and we do this. For instance, we're right now during this month and the next doing an update exercise, which might take us more or less time, depending on what's happening right now with this pandemics and the impact it will have. Not the short-term impact, although is relevant, but more, imagine that we find that remote work and remote teaching will have a huge impact in the future, and will really accelerate this trend. We should change. Obviously we have scenarios which already had this sort of trends in it. Okay, more technological, more disruptive. If we think reality is speeding towards them, then we must stretch them even further. Okay, and we do it well. Every year we look at them to update them. Every 2 years we look at the uncertainties. I'd say from the experience, well, our track record is not that large. When we look at a company like Shell, they change their main assumptions every 10 years, maybe, something like that.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Diego and Antonio, for your observations. I think the question from Elena, that was exactly around this topic about how frequent this should be done. I guess that the answer is a mix of it should be embedded in your strategic planning process. And at the same time, of course, you need to be aware of what is happening around you and whether you need to reevaluate the assumptions that go into your scenarios every now and then, and whether you need to shift gears there. But thank you, and thank you, Elena, also for your answer, for your question on this. I don't think we have that much more time. But I just have one particular comment or question, maybe for Antonio, because we've been talking, GALP is a big company, Shell is a big company. Maybe people in our audience are not working for big corporations, right? How applicable is this approach, and how often have you seen smaller businesses applying scenario thinking? And what is your perception about the impact and its relevance for smaller organizations?
Well, this week I was working with 2 companies that describe what, one has, I think, 60 employees, and they are, the dimension, of course, the oil, GALP is here, and it's one of the companies in Portugal that are more developed in terms of scenario building. but scenarios, it's also a way of thinking. So, even startups, I work a lot with incubators, accelerators. So, this idea of linking scenarios with open innovation. So this idea of scenarios can be like a part of your planning process, especially in big organizations. They have these more structured processes, and should be, in my opinion. But it can also be a way of organizing your leadership, the way you think about the future, and the way you anchor your strategy. So what is a leader? A leader is not, nobody believes someone that says that knows how the future will be, I think. We believe people that have a picture of the future, that, this is how we see the future, the next 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Of course, for companies like GALP, it can be 20 years, 30 years, because we're talking about energy, paradigm. But we can say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years. In 5 years, that's how we see the evolution of our context, and we have evidence supporting this. And for this evolution, for this evolution, we have this strategy, but we are ready for other scenarios. And this, okay, so I can trust you. We acknowledge that we don't know, and we are ready for other scenarios, and we know what we need to change if other scenarios develop. And I think this gives trust to stakeholders, shareholders, employees, etc. And this can be a formal process or an informal thinking process of a core team in a small or medium company.
So, Anton, I think it's a very valid point, and I think maybe we will need to end here because the time is up. But I think that idea that you're sharing, that when you engage in scenario thinking, you are also appealing to a form of leadership that is not this sort of centralized, sort of know-it-all type of attitude, but rather someone who is willing to say, I don't know. And we need to collectively try to figure out what we need to do. So that leadership becomes more about facilitating the collective intelligence, and then when the time comes, steering and getting people aligned towards that, and not the type of leadership that kind of centralizes all the decision-making processes and kind of takes everything on his or her shoulders. And that requires some level of combination between being humble to acknowledge there are many ways to go forward and I need your help in that, and at the same time being strong about staying on course and ensuring execution, and that balance needs to be there. So I think it's a very important aspect of, you need a certain type of leadership to have this, effective in any organization. And I'm happy to hear also that small businesses are also very much engaged. And as you said, scenario thinking is to a large extent a matter of mindset, right? And it's not just a process, it's a way of looking at the world and building agility in your organization. So I'd like to thank you both for being here, for sharing your knowledge and your expertise and your insights. It was very, very useful and very helpful. For those watching us, this will be available also on our website, on the Role to Play website. So feel free, of course, to watch this again and reach out to us if you have any other questions and you need further help on this topic. All right. Thank you very much, Antonio and Diogo, and take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Milton. And
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much all. Thank you.